Hello everyone, I'm Justice Graves and I'm currently running to be a member of the Narragansett Regional School Committee here in Templeton, Massachusetts, and today's video is a continuation of the topic racial and sex stereotyping and scapegoating and compelled speech here on my campaign channel. Again, this video, just like the last one, the first one in this particular playlist, this video is for administrators, this is for parents, this is for concerned parties. This shouldn't really be for people under the age of 18 because the content may be difficult to understand. Not necessarily difficult to understand, but difficult to process, and you really need more of a guiding hand to go through this, and so I really want to stress that and preview that before we go into this, as always. And I just want to talk about what we're just going to kind of get right into it. So I'm going to tell you that the topic of today's is we are going to actively look to identify the cycle of modern racism that we identified in the last video. And we're going to look at how critical race theory trainings are textbook bullying and harassment. So I really want to stress that. So today it's going to be more of an official, more of a strategic PowerPoint that we're going to go through. And so I just want to re-point out what exactly is going on again. So remember, we have this foundation of this new racism. This foundation includes breaking will, you break trust, it's about desensitization, it is about gaslighting, it is about, essentially getting you to the point where you start to have low self-esteem and you start to doubt yourself. And so you go into this self-prostration and gaslighting. And when you first start this cycle, you start off by, of course, saying that you are a racist. It's false in the beginning. You start to normalize abuse. You start to say that emotional distress may be racism. You start to normalize what people are doing to you within the foundation. And then you go over and you start to enact racism that you think may be allyship. And that's a word I want you to get used to, because allyship is being used in these diversity trainings in an inappropriate way to say that these specific acts, which are actually manifestations of the diversity trainers' racism, are acts of allyship. I want you to get that sort of within your repertoire as we go through this sort of step by step. And then once you do that, again, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And you fulfill it, and then you are indeed a racist now. So it is a huge problem. And again, we are going to go through and we're going to talk about how there is a cycle, about, again, how there's this cycle, but how there's this untouchables group. The second video in this was supposed to be about the video that I'm doing right now, should have been replaced with this video that I talked about at the end of the other video called The Faces of White Supremacy, but I thought this was way more critical and way more important, just because you need to be able to understand out in the wild and out in academic settings and out in academic trainings what this can sort of manifest into. So again, we will talk about this top group, the untouchables, in the next video, hopefully, unless something else comes up. But I thought this was way more important and way more imperative to sort of show you in the wild what this looks like. So when you're faced with a diversity trainer who talks about this, you may see a graphic like this. It talks about that you have to start by talking about racism. You have to get comfortable with racism. Uncomfortable, comfortable, and uncomfortable. You have to start with yourself. You got to keep focused on the change. You got to practice allyship. This is why I pre-warned you to be aware of this word. And then you have to take action. It's always about taking action with yourself. It doesn't say it specifically in this. It doesn't say with yourself. They do also mean within yourself as well, but they mean to take a specific action that they set as being anti-racist. So what is wrong with this cycle? Like, what is wrong with it? In terms of any other cycle with any other diversity training, in terms of any other cycle with regards to science, with regards to self-help, what is wrong with this cycle? It doesn't pivot off of anything else, and you'll notice that this anti-racism part, and this is common for all of these diversity trainings, whether they're called by critical race theory, whether they call themselves white supremacists or not, this never results in anything. They never talk about how this actually does anything. They talk about how they minimize the physical action of actually rejecting racism and confronting it, And they say you got to go back into the cycle and do it all over again. And so what does this look like? Well, we can actually break it down into the foundation and the 3 phases that we identified in the other video and that I re-brought up again. So let's go to the next slide. And you see it quite readily. So look, the foundation, talking about your racism, getting comfortable with it. This is all about the foundation because they're going to try and desensitize you into that racism isn't bad. We know it's bad. We know it's evil. That acts of racism may or may not be harmful. I personally believe that an act of racism hurts the person that you're doing it towards, and it hurts and inflicts damage onto yourself. It chips away a little bit at your soul, and the people who are really good at white supremacy, their souls are so damaged it doesn't even translate. So it's just that's where we are. Then you have this phase 1, which is the self-prostration. They always want it to be about yourself here. Phase 2 is normalizing abuse, as we remember. You got to keep focused. You got to be uncomfortable, and you can't stop being uncomfortable. You got to practice allyship, and you can't stop talking about it. You can't stop talking about race. Race, race, race. Remember, and this is something I don't think I mentioned in the other video, but Kate Slater in that UNH webinar, she couldn't stop talking about how she was white. She just could not stop talking about it. These diversity trainers, and even ones that are minorities who do this training, because unfortunately that happens as well, these trainers cannot stop talking about their race, or specifically if it's a minority trainer, they can't stop talking about white people. It's always about whiteness, white power. It's always about white, 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 white. And what that sort of clues you in on is that they're more focused, especially the ones who are white that are perpetrating this, on their own power, on being the powerful ones, and transferring that problem of racism onto you. And you need to recognize that if they can't stop talking about their white power, that's not a problem that you have. That's their problem. That is their own self-interest on full display. And I want you to keep that in mind. And where are we? And again, taking anti-racism actions. But remember, as we've gone through this cycle, this is not intended to really do anything. This is intended to 100% just perpetuate the cycle. Because remember, this doesn't jump out of anything. And I want to point something else out, too, in this next graphic. When you have to be comfortable with racism, and you have to start with yourself, I call this the marinating. They want you to marinate with it. It's not about marinating with your emotions. It's very deceptive. It's about marinating with the idea that racism, quote unquote, isn't bad, when we know it's bad. And we know that people who perpetuate it should be properly shunned from society. And again, it starts with the self. And these arrows point to how, while this is sort of a cycle, each of these things that you see sort of pointed to each other relate to each other. If you're talking about racism, you're going to keep focused on the change. If you're getting uncomfortable, practicing allyship. And again, starting with the self, these acts of anti-racism they're selfish. And these trainers are actually so honest about what they're talking about that they'll tell you that most people, quote unquote, fail at this last part because any anti-racist action that they take is selfish and it's in their self-interest. And again, like I said, common sense in the government, you take them at face value when they tell you the first time. All right, where are we? But let's talk about which cycles that are actually common in both science and with regards to self-help that show something different, because this can be very easy to misconstrue with other cycles. So let's talk about how there are differences. The first, let's talk about something difficult. Again, this is why this video is not necessarily for kids. Let's talk about the addiction cycle and the recovery cycle. When you're in an addiction with something, and then you translate over to a recovery, it's a translation. So there's this gigantic cycle going on in this picture, but the purpose in most recovery places, AA meetings, etc., they'll sort of show this sort of pattern of when you break out into a new cycle, but there's a breakout. There's no breakout. There's never a breakout. There's never a breakout from this point. It's always you go back into the foundation, you break out and you do something. And then even within the recovery cycle, there are other branches that you could talk about that you break out on. I'm not an expert in AA meetings. I'm not an expert in addiction. But this is very true. Let's even talk about something science related. Now, I'm not, I only had to take honors chemistry 1 when I was in college. I am not an expert on the Krebs cycle. I never took AP biology. I don't even know if this is an AP biology, but I do know this is an important cycle, chemical cycle. So let's talk about the Krebs cycle. Look at the Krebs cycle. I understand a little bit, enough of this to sort of understand what's going on. Look, all of these reactions are bouncing off. There's something else happening. Water flows, not flows, but water interacts, then goes off. You have all of these different, I think, salt compounds. I know that N is salt. Sodium, N is sodium. So I'm assuming some of these are salt compounds. There's different things happening with energy going off, ATP. So there are things happening, the Krebs cycle, it continues, it goes, but there are these other things that are sort of jumping off of it. So the Krebs cycle interacts. Notice, and you'll see this in all of these different things, never branches off. Never, ever. Never does anything productive. And they always talk about it. They're very honest. And then even within the cycle of change, it talks about beating this upward spiral. You're going to a higher plane of change. Yes, it's a cycle that maybe some things break out, maybe some things don't, but you're at least moving. If we're talking about a 3D cycle, you're moving up. Now, if you're in this cycle, and this sort of graphic I've added onto it demonstrates it, you're just kind of going in. All of these people who are so horribly, manipulated by this, their worlds sort of cave in to this sort of experience. If they don't, get better, they don't move up, it goes down. They go down in society. They go down in terms of their own mental thinking, and their racism becomes significantly more apparent, especially with the people who get really sucked into this. But let's talk about something that's also very similar to this. What is a cycle that is hard to get out of, that doesn't have any spin-off points, that really resembles this? Well, possibly bullying. And not possibly bullying, workplace bullying and any bullying in general meets the qualifications for this. So let's just look at this really quickly. You have this self-judgment. You think you're bad. And most people who are bullies are previous victims. So they start from a place of they feel bad about themselves. There's a negative belief in place. They are guilty and they deserve to be punished. Does that sound like anything? They seek evidence to support a belief. Does that sound like anything? Behavior, they hurt someone. Does that sound like anything that we've, talked about recently? They have this intense feeling of power. It's long-term. This intense feeling of power, and then long-term that becomes bad, so then they go back into the self-judgment phase. Essentially what's up here is the bullying position, and down here is the victimization or the self-victimization position. And so if you map that onto the phases that we were talking about, you'll notice they're in a different order. Because when you are a bully, you are way later in the phase. You are already self-fulfilling the prophecy multiple times. So what you'll notice is that while you may start in phase 1, if you are somebody who isn't necessarily in a position of power within this hierarchy of this new racism, you'll seek support for your belief from that hierarchy, from that group of white supremacists, from the untouchables that reaffirms the negative beliefs in phase 1, and then you'll go and you'll hurt someone, and then you'll just normalize what you did. It's very, very toxic. And in this next graphic, again, this just says it again, up top, these two behaviors, phase 3 and phase 2, essentially are the bully position. This is when you're actually doing awful things. The victimize position, or the self-victimization position, is essentially when you're in phase 1 and you're in the foundation. This is what's happening. And just for a quick reference, we're going to go back to this slide. Again, you can see it, all of the phases. I'm going to leave it for a second. And I want to just point out that if someone is trying to force you to say or do something that you don't agree with, or that you know isn't true about yourself, or that know isn't true about an action that you've taken, and they mock and they intimidate you repeatedly, it's that repeated aspect that's so important, just to get a response out of you, That's bullying and it's harassment. Plain and simple. And it sort of shows this mesh between how that racism is essentially just qualified bullying. How that diversity training is just qualified bullying and harassment of everybody in that sort of intertwined sort of situation. Not intertwined, but that meshed and intimate relationship, because they really are the same thing. Alright. And just to remind you again, you have the foundation that sits within phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, and how they all cycle and how they all relate. And again, remember, in this cycle, it is slightly reversed. It is in reverse only because, and this is essentially a part of the cycle because, again, you're looking for beliefs. Where are you going to get that belief from? You're going to get it from the untouchables. Now, something that I want to point out before we end this, because I'm going to try and end this video a little bit early, keep it under 20 minutes, way under 20 minutes, is that you can, there are actually several videos in the description that I've linked in the description that you can look at to get a clear example of how this critical race theory is, how this new white supremacy essentially is workplace bullying, because this woman, Dr. Carolyn Borysenko, she's in here, on several videos has talked about this, and her dissertation in organizational psychology was on workplace bullying. So she has done a lot of different activities and a lot of different personal studies for her dissertation on this. She does a lot of coaching in this realm. Not exclusively in this realm, but this is sort of where her wheelhouse is. And so she has all these things. Again, the definition of workplace bullying, because this also happens in the workplace, because educators bully educators to get them to push this onto children. This is how it sort of starts, really. That workplace bullying is defined as the experience of repeated and unwelcomed negative acts, such as criticism and humiliation, remember, repeated, occurring at a place of employment, that are intended to cause fear, distress, or harm to the target from one or more individuals from a source of power, and that the target cannot defend themselves. So the way that bullying sort of works and the way that these sort of racists work is that they make you racist, or they put you in the position of you are a racist so that you can't defend yourself. That's what they do. So I just want to point that out. And this is from Bartlett and Bartlett 2011. This is from a literature review, a very good literature review at the beginning of the 2010s that sort of summarized this. And the video where she describes this is in the description. There's this whole thing where she actually goes through, you don't have to hit all of these items, but if you hit some of them, and I'll leave this on the screen for a second so that you can look at it or take a screenshot if you want to. If you meet some of these qualifications for workplace bullying, at least consistently in any of these categories, whether it's the light blue category, the peach category, or the dark purple, which is like really intimate acts of violence, such as sexual harassment, blocking, intimidation, and spontaneous anger, if you meet any of the qualifications for these, at least several times, or at least most of the time, that's workplace bullying. So I just wanted to point that out. This is the end, so I'm going to switch back to my position and exit out. So that is it. That is how you can sort of identify the cycle of racism. If you see a cycle that, pushes you back into it again, that's sort of how that sort of works. Not sort of how that sort of works, that is how it works. That is how the situation sort of manifests. And again, sort of just to demonstrate that CRT, as we call it, and that racial and sex stereotyping and scapegoating trainings are textbook bullying. It's just a way to shame you so that way you feel unempowered and that you feel like you are unable to defend yourself, and so that way you agree with it, so you go with their acts of racism. It's very insidious. In the next video, I promise it's going to be about the faces of white power. I've already recorded it. I hope it's good. And share this around to interested parties, and subscribe if you want to understand more about this and how this will impact education. Thank you.